Yeah, I was like, I mean, I was there for like the whole thing.
Yeah.
Beginning, middle, and end.
What a terrible, terrible idea. This is Maynard Trigg, a book that I wrote. It's a low sci-fi coming-of-age fantasy story that I'm immensely proud of. This is my first published novel. It's extremely bad and you won't find it anywhere on the internet. Because it's genuinely awful. Back in 2012 when I was on holiday, I was sitting on a couch with a friend of mine from childhood, drinking beers and watching the first Pokemon cartoons, and just hanging out. My friend was like, hey, Pokemon's pretty weird. What would that be like if it was real? What would that be like if, you know, you lived in a world with actual Pokemon? The kind of thing that you do when you're young and you're drinking, right? We pitched back and forth, discussing the geopolitical implications of the whole thing and what we do in that world and what the problems might be that might be different than our own world. Then I went away for 6 months, wrote a 45,000 word manuscript that was a dark, gritty, satirical reimagining of the Pokemon world with me in charge. I pretty much forgot all about the book entirely until just before Christmas last year, when a friend sent me a message which included a link to a tweet. It was a subtweet from an ex-girlfriend of mine that goes like this. Things I found while cleaning out my apartment. My ex's very not great Pokemon spin-off novel. The spin-off novel she's referring to is the one that I wrote. The story follows the titular Hendrix in The Necessity of Hendrix, and it's a thriller, I guess. It plays out a bit like a procedural detective story, using the cliches and genre conventions of pulpy action noir stories, combined with the weirdness of the Pokemon world, into what I guess is approximately a story. Here's the thing. The book sucks. A lot of the Pokemon content itself isn't very inventive to start with, and that's the main crux of the narrative. On top of that, the conventions and the ideas that I try and parody in the pulp or the detective genre just end up feeling kind of like the things they're pretending to parody, especially when it comes to the way that women were treated in that story. I think I thought I was doing something interesting and edgy, but ultimately it falls kind of flat and reads as fairly sexist. For the most part, the book ends up just being the thing it's trying to parody. The reason I bring this up now is I was sorting through some of my mom's belongings from her divorce when I stumbled upon an actual printed copy of this book. I immediately threw it out. Partly because I'm a little bit ashamed of it, partly because I know if it ever got into the hands of my editor, he would never speak to me again and probably flee the country, but mostly because I don't like who I was when I wrote it. And I didn't want to just sit down one evening, have a whiskey, read it, and then forget about it forever. Because ever since it resurfaced when I was going through those boxes, I've had trouble not thinking about it. So in a vain attempt to make this into some kind of catharsis for myself, and hopefully something that might be useful if you're a young writer or you're just interested in storytelling, I'm going to attempt to tell you what I've learned from rereading this manuscript, and hopefully what I've learned about life in general. Maybe. This first lesson seems really obvious, but I remember being a young, budding writer and ready to sink my teeth into a franchise that I really enjoy. I think everyone wants to take a stab at their favorite properties, whether it's Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings or Star Wars. You think that you can take the reins and you could just tell that great story or just tell that idea or extrapolate on that one sentence or that little bit of world building. You think it's going to be the best, next greatest thing, and you know, the truth is it's probably not. And that's why a lot of fanfiction isn't very good. And on top of that, it's a sad fact that you're not going to get your big break working on a huge Disney production by making their stuff. They don't like unsolicited materials, they're never going to read your pitch or your script, so stop now. Which isn't to say that fanfiction doesn't have value. You can actually generate a small, dedicated fanbase and then continue on to write your own original content and direct that fanbase to read it. But I guess what I'm saying is if you're trying to break into the industry, the best way to do it isn't to make fun of the world's most financially successful franchise in a book that's a bit shit.
I narrated like probably 6 or 7 chapters. You paid me about $25 per chapter.
Sounds about right.
Basically, it's Detective Pikachu in a weird way, except if Detective Pikachu, I think Detective Pikachu was good because it, ignored a lot of stuff in the games. It just got rid of battling to a degree, got rid of catching Pokemon, got rid of, Pokeballs, it got rid of, this extra fluff that's really hard to translate into a narrative.
Whereas I tried to
You kept it. Yeah. You were just I'm going to explain Pokeballs, I'm going to explain battling, I'm going to explain, how a detective agency would work in a Pokemon universe, but keeping everything from the Pokemon universe.
I even kept in, like, all of the wars and stuff that had happened, and, like, I folded them into a backstory.
You took all of the regions, and you took, like, what they... In the games, like, all the regions are sort of, like, loose analogs to, like, real-world kind of locations. But you took that and then applied the geopolitical...
That's right, yeah.
You applied, like, the history and, like, geopolitics of those locations to these fake regions. So, like, Sinnoh, which is... It's like or at least in the story, you line Sinnoh up with China to where... Like, Sinnoh is, like, the main exporter of Pokeballs.
Yeah.
They're generally low quality. And that became, like, a major plot point.
It was a huge plot point in the story.
Where it's, like, these low-quality Pokeballs that people are using to catch Pokemon. It's just...
What an insane idea.
But then, like, on top of that, you have just humans with guns and punching each other.
And hugely complex, like, narrative. Like, the mystery itself is so complicated.
Yeah.
It's, like, impossible as a human to read it.
Right.
Like, I just don't know what I was thinking. So the more I've been thinking about it, and the more I've reread this book and this story, the reason it doesn't work is because there's no heart. It feels empty. It's clear I was intensely intrigued in writing a story about the real-world implications of living in a world with these monsters and these Pokemon and the different variables that come with that, like the Pokeballs and the dimensionality of those and all the different technologies that exist in that world. I thought was a fascinating concept, but ultimately I was never sure of why I was writing it. I think I just picked a universe that I knew really well. I grew up with a lot of Pokemon and I'm very familiar with that franchise, but there was no reason why humbled me with 0.5 of an arts degree and not quite my business degree and basically no wins under my belt, should pick up the reins of this world-famous franchise and be in charge of my own little fanfiction corner. And I think that's where it all came unstuck. Rather than interpolate on the themes and the ideas of Pokemon and try and examine what makes it work and question whether or not it's a valid franchise to be continuing and how they tell their stories, I just wanted to tell my story. A lot of the material that was from the Pokemon world or the lore was basically just a prop for me. And, you know, some of it works quite well. For example, the main character is often struggling to make ends meet. Very frequently, his gear isn't in working order. There's even a scene where he tries to open a Pokeball and tries it 6 or 7 times, but is unable to get it open. It expands a little bit on the world lore, just enough that it could be classed as technically interesting, and it also gives you an insight into this character. It's the first time you realize that his financial hardship is more than just an affectation, he really is hurting for coin. It's multi-purpose scene work. It conveys information about the world, the character, and progresses the plot forward, essentially giving the main character his incentive to become engaged in the events of the story. This is the only time this happens in 45,000 words. A bad example of when I do it is every other scene in this book. It's not that necessarily reinterpreting a world through this fanfiction lens is a bad idea, it's about how and why you're doing it. The way that I use the world building only progressed the plot in the most egregious ways, or was some weird fan servicey element that I thought would be cool or interesting to people that were as deep into the lore as I was. Rather than taking the care to allow and embed little bits of world building and information throughout the story, I decided the easiest way to get my point across was to make the 3 main characters veterans of this great Pokemon war and have them constantly remind each other of different events that happened during that war. It is basically the cheap equivalent of doing a Skullduggery Pleasant series, but without any of the intrigue or the academic honesty in making those characters feel realized before we start to learn their secrets. And obviously, one of the key tenets to world building is self-restraint. You, as the author, should know everything about the world that the story is taking place in, and it's your responsibility, working with your editor and test readers, to find out the balance between how much you should tell and how much you should keep to yourself. Not to get into the debate of just how much you should include, but generally speaking, you want enough to move the scene along, and then just enough that there are some lingering questions where people can start to become invested and engaged in the world. Your job as the writer is then to smuggle in bits of information when you can, using world building or little tidbits to solve scenes, or make the story just generally more colorful or interesting. By the time your reader finishes your story, they should feel intimate with the world, but not really be able to pin down exactly why. This seems obvious now when I talk about it, but back then it wasn't, and I still struggle with it sometimes. I wasn't interested in interrogating the story I'd written, I just wrote the narrative. I assumed that the basic strength alone of my prose, or somehow that I was just better than other writers that I knew, that this story would be successful, that it would have merit. And that's not how stories work, and that's not how anything works. I was arrogant to the point where looking back on it, I wonder what I was thinking at all. because I can tell you the book wasn't better for having an entire scene where two characters painstakingly argue about how perfectly legal Pokeballs are made in an underground factory. It's not interesting, it's not good storytelling, and it had no place in that narrative, but there was no one to tell me no, and I didn't want to hear no. If you went back, and obviously, like, we can't change anything now, and I think if we changed anything, we wouldn't be where we are, but is there anything about that project that we... Obviously, not doing it would be a great option. Like, is there anything you would change going back? Or anything that you think that we've learned from it that was pretty crucial?
I think, like, just... You know, even I've, like, learned a lot with doing projects where it's just like, start smaller. Mm-hmm. And probably... I mean, nowadays, I'm all about failing faster. I think had this whole series of projects, had they failed faster, it would have not led to this. So yeah. I think, like, the rate at which we failed was adequate.
Right.
I'm glad well, I'm not glad, but when they did fail, it was like, all right. In hindsight, it was good that they failed.
I've skimmed through the book twice when putting together my ideas and thoughts for this video, and one of the most surprising things about it is just how bad the character work is. I'm obviously 6 or 7 years on from when I finalized this project, but even looking back now, I'm stunned at just how weird a lot of the characters are, and how inconsistent they seem. While I can see the beginnings of my style and the themes and the topics that I tend to cover now in my writing, there was no honesty about it. There was no control over what I was doing. I was so obsessed with how clever and interesting I was being with reinterpreting the Pokemon lore and sneaking in these cool ideas that I forgot that for it to be a good story, it has to be interesting. It has, on its periphery, embedded the same concepts that I talk about in my storytelling now. Parenthood, loss, love, and just trying to exist. And one of the core themes about everything I've ever made is how do you be happy and how do you be okay with who you are? And how do you own up to being yourself? And all of that's well and good, but when a young person writes that into a satirical Pokemon novel, it's not good. More so than that, for a story that's supposed to be a critical examination of a franchise, it's not that interested in the Pokemon. It's a story that I was reporting that breaks down and reinterprets some of the key and interesting facts about that universe, but in the story itself, it does that maybe once, and not very well. Most of the book is overwritten, desperate character conflict, trying at all times to be as genuinely engaging as possible while actually not understanding what made the characters interesting or what people can relate to. It was basically a bunch of war veterans arguing about nothing. There was no consideration for its main cast and why they might be in conflict. I just wanted them to argue because it felt like an easy way to move scenes along. At the very least, I understood that scenes needed a valence shift, but I didn't understand why or how to craft them in a way that felt like it was natural or it even fit the book at all. A scene, for example, that demonstrates my complete lack of understanding of what I was doing is around the end of Act 3. This is just before the 4th act, and it's when the story begins to ramp up into the proper action of the piece. The three main characters, the titular Hendrix, Brock, and Volkner, are in a car together, driving back from a meeting that went pretty poorly. The central thrust of this narrative is they're trying to track down a villain who is elusive and has some kind of dirt on all of them. She's sort of blackmailing them all in little pieces to try and get them to stop pursuing her so she can get up to whatever her evil means might be. But our heroes decide to bull ahead bravely anyway, accepting the potential consequences of whatever information might be out there is leaked, and they'll suffer the consequences. So we're in the car, and there's this news story that's come out from this villain, and it's about Volkner's time in the war, and he's reading out the article to his friends in the car. This time, it's about how Volkner and his boyfriend during the war were together. And the big twist of the scene is we quickly learn that the boyfriend was engaged to someone that isn't Volkner. Let's stop. What kind of place does this have in a satirical Pokemon drama or a pulp detective story? While it's an interesting premise for a mystery story, even like a procedural cop drama, some fun backstory you find out 2 or 3 seasons later that overcomplicates and makes the interpersonal relationships between our heroes more compelling, doesn't work in book 1. And it surely doesn't work in this story. The whole thing feels like a line lifted wholesale from a thriller about some hacker who's got access to people's lives and backstories. But why is it in a car, and why is he reading it off a phone? There's so much of this story that is bad to the point where it makes very little sense, but scenes like this make me wonder if I thought I knew what I was doing and I wasn't just treading water the whole time. And not to say that character inflections like this or little moments or backstory reveals like this can't make a story fascinating or compelling, But just that it's pretty obvious from an example like this, I didn't know what I was doing. I was essentially using the facade of a Pokemon satire to tell a story that I didn't want to tell. I was unwillingly injecting topics in that I wanted to write about because I didn't really want to write this story. None of the ideas, none of the serious topics in this narrative work at all. It should have been entirely a slapstick, jokey, satirical punch-up about how dumb it would be to live in a world with Pokemon. You could even cast Ryan Reynolds as Pikachu, for instance. I guess my point is that now when I write, I'm fairly self-aware of the themes and the ideas that come out subconsciously when I'm writing, and it's not that you have to stop yourself from putting those in your work, but being aware of them means you can address them in the edits, and at the very least, you know what you're writing for, and you know why you're writing. So when you're writing your next story, keep an eye out for things that keep popping up in your work, ideas, themes, issues that keep reoccurring as you write. It tends to be the stuff that's going on in your head or in your life at the time. The trick is to realize it's happening, acknowledge it, and just be aware of it in the edits. It's not something you have to necessarily address or remove, but depending on the kind of story you're telling, it may not have a place and should be removed. If you have any predictions for Aron's reaction.
He's probably gonna drop just probably a few F-bombs. He might ask, put his head in his hands and be like, I'm editing a glorified fanfic author.
That was pretty much Adam's reaction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the fanfic angle is really going to freak him out.
Yeah.
I'm the editor of the Maynard Triggs series.
Yeah.
The Veilmakers series, rather.
That's right.
Our working relationship is Dave will smash out a novel, and then I will swoop in
and try and help me unbreak it.
Try to keep it alive.
Yep. Try to repair the damage I've done with my cavalier attitude.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's always an interesting experience.
It's always. I feel like every book that we do, we're coming to the close of book 2. Every one we do, there's a new and exciting challenge that I didn't anticipate me getting us into.
Yes.
Yeah, well, you're like, oh, he's fixed all these.
He's made decisions.
But look at all these weird errors now. What's this all about? It's very much that. The reason I've got you in is I've been working on this video, which is about so Maynard Trigg, which is this book here, obviously. First book. Well, it's my I guess my published novel.
Mm-hmm.
The one that I'm the most proud of. It's like one of the best things I've ever done, and I'm really excited to like work on the second one. And it's, I think, something that I made for the right reasons. It was like I wanted to tell a story that I cared about that I thought was going to be really good. This isn't my first published novel. I don't have a copy because it doesn't technically exist.
What do you mean you don't have a copy?
In print at the moment. We're going back and I'm getting some reprints done. So I was gonna have one to show you, but there was a slight delay on getting it printed. So I'm gonna tell you what the first published novel was I ever had.
Okay.
And you have to promise not to quit. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay.
I promise not to.
You say that now.
I couldn't.
Point, I'm worried that like it's gonna break you, so strap in.
I'm ready.
So back in 2013, before we knew each other, I went on holiday. It was like second schoolies kind of thing, but we went to just like at the end of the year, we used to go to a different vacation spot each year.
Yeah.
And from that vacation, I had a conversation with someone. I was drunk on the couch. I had a conversation with someone about a particular franchise. And they said, "Oh, what if that was real? How would that go? And what would you do with it?" And we were just like chatting and like shooting a shit or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And then I woke up the next morning and I just started like writing it. And then I didn't stop writing it. And then I had a 45,000 word manuscript, based entirely on this franchise. It was a satirical kind of take on it. It was I guess you call it fan fiction ultimately. So it was about this hard-boiled detective, who sort of, it was very Dresden Files, kind of this hardboiled detective in this kind of underbelly city, but set in this particular franchise.
Yeah.
Do you want to guess what franchise it may have been?
I am I'm leaning toward Pokemon.
It was. It was a full satirical Pokemon noir detective story. And we fucking published it. It was out there for a long time.
Oh my god.
Yeah. So that was a lot for me.
Okay. Whoa. There are a lot of questions.
So, yeah, go ahead. I thought
mind.
there might be.
What did you do for the cover?
Well, we didn't have a. So
What did you do for the cover,
So
Dave?
the cover at the time, we don't have a copy of that printed cover, but I'll put one up on screen and I can show you one later. But Crystal's redoing the cover because we're going to do some exclusive reprints of it just for our top tier Patreons.
Okay.
I think the price that we ballparked was like, if you subscribe for like $100 a month, you get one. Because we were like, this shouldn't be read by any living soul. It's so bad. Like, it's so bad.
I really want to see it.
The craziest thing about it is I was way too deep into it. Like, I was like, couldn't see the forest, the trees, right? Because I was like fucking inside this thing. And like, I took all of the different regions, and I even developed like this like alternate world history that would have happened if that stuff had happened. Because there's like a bunch of wars and stuff in the Pokemon universe. So I used that, and then I used the coded analogs for the different regions. You know how it's like, oh, this Pokemon region is like Japan or whatever.
Yeah,
and then I leveraged that to look at like the socio and geopolitical implications of like what that would be if there was also Pokemon in it. Like, I kind of lost my mind.
It's such a rabbit hole.
It was real deep, dude. Down. It was real deep.
Oh, I want to see. I want to see this.
Yeah.
I want to see this product.
Has this changed how you look at me?
I haven't read it yet.
Okay, because it's really bad.
Let's do that.
Let's do that
chapter by chapter reading, and then
let's regroup.
Perhaps by the end,
maybe in part 2 we'll see how we are.
Yeah.
Yeah, real bad. Yeah. So this video is about that, and it's about what I learned from that process. And hopefully, I've kind of asked a few people that were involved to kind of reflect on that as well. And hopefully by the end of it, I can learn something about how far I've come as both a creative person and hopefully just as a human.
Absolutely.
Because I was the worst. So embarrassing. Yeah, so that was my first published book. I'm glad that I've done something good now.
Yep.
But yeah, I'm excited to expose you to just...
No, yeah, I can't wait.
Wait, I can probably read you an excerpt. Hang on, I have Dropbox on my phone. This next part is really what I wanted to get to with this video. It's about what I did with the story once it was completed, and it's about who I was when all of this happened. It's also the part where things get kind of personal, but I think being honest about who you are and where you were in your life when you made something is really important. Which is ironic given what you're about to learn about who I was, but just stick with me. I wrote the book during a period in my life where I wasn't doing very well. I wasn't so much writing for the love of making something, but because I thought I should. I don't know, I was trying to prove a point, I guess. More or less, the idea was that because I declared myself a writer my entire life, that what you do as a writer is you have a published book. That's what you do. You publish a book. And this would somehow validate me or make me happy or something. It would take me from being an amateur to being someone that could be in the spotlight, or at least someone that was validated in some way, in some professional setting, or... I don't know, this idea that if I wrote this edgy, cool, interesting Pokemon story, that somehow that would get me like the lotto ticket. Like I'd had the best idea in storytelling, and that was gonna, launch me to success somehow. I wasn't interested in what makes a good story. I was interested in how do you get to a point where people say you made something good. If it was sensational enough, I'd win the book lotto, and that would be my ticket. Obviously, that's not what happened. What really happened is I wrote this story, showed it to people again, rewrote it, showed it to people again, and continually tried to convince them that it was good. I wasn't in a financial position to pay an editor, and due to some personal decisions and kind of who I was at the time, the two most important people in my life were people I was hurting on a daily basis, more or less. I couldn't ask for advice from them or solicit feedback from my friends because I put myself in a position where I wasn't willing to accept their criticism. And I put myself in a position where I wasn't willing to be vulnerable at all. Which is to say that the project was doomed from its inception because one of the only things that makes good art is being vulnerable and wanting to make it good. And that comes from the why you wrote the book in the first place. I didn't foster healthy creative relationships. I didn't foster healthy interpersonal relationships. I didn't own my mistakes, and I avoided taking responsibility for almost every action I could, thinking somehow this would free me up to be who I wanted to be in my own time. Ultimately, after everything, assembling a team, a talented illustrator, a fantastic voice actor, it just didn't work. The project failed for two other reasons that we haven't talked about. A, I couldn't afford to pay my friends, and B, I was dishonest about why I was doing what I was doing and what I was doing. I was lying to myself and everyone around me about what I was trying to achieve and why I was trying to achieve it. It wasn't this great artistic foray. I was just a scared kid trying to prove a point. Rather than go in for grounded, reasonable targets and grow something that I genuinely cared about, I did the opposite. In hindsight, I should have written a few short stories, tendered them to different writing websites, found the most popular one, developed that into a manuscript, and gone from there. Instead, I just assumed my writing was good enough. I wrote the book, and I assumed it was brilliant. And it meant that the story was for nobody by a scared kid that didn't know what he was talking about. It was something I felt I should do instead of something I wanted to do. That meant when it was time to ask for help, I had to overpitch what I was doing. I had to try and convince people that people already liked this story when no one had read it and no one wanted to read it because no one was interested. Instead of what I could have done, which was build a small audience and then point to that small audience, I was so obsessed with getting that big smash hit right out of the gate that I wasn't interested in building a foundation. This epiphany, while it was about the book, really changed my life in general. I made some pretty big changes right afterwards, both in my personal relationships and my working life. I quit a job, moved on with some interpersonal relationships, and I sort of took a really long look at myself and went through a few years of some hard work to get to where I am now. Really what I learned is that I was making things for the wrong reason, and even though now we're not making the most popular content in the world and we're not getting hundreds of thousands of views, I'm really proud of what we do. I'm really proud of this book. It's the best thing I've ever done, and I'm really proud that each week we make a show that I think is genuinely good for a small group of people who really enjoy engaging with us and enjoy forming a little community. It's a small little humble family, and I think that's pretty cool. I'm not looking to win the lotto and become successful. I'm looking to stay small and stay honest. Find people who help you make good things, and find people who you love making things with. What's the point in making something if you don't love the process of creating it? I love writing. I love working with my editor, Aron. I love making the shows that we create because I managed somehow to find a group of people that I genuinely don't deserve who spend time with me making things and make me a better person. I'm not sure if there's a moral or a lesson here. Maybe the best thing that I could offer is make your own content, make original work, and back yourself, genuinely. And don't lie about how successful you are. Just be honest. Write good stories, make good art, and pay people when you can. All of this is to say, I guess, when I look back at my old work, I don't cringe as hard as I maybe might have done a few years ago. Instead, I try to be thankful for what I have now and thankful that I've grown as a person and an artist and that I'm not who I was when I wrote that. Or if you want a more cynical outlook, maybe the best way to prove that you've moved on with your life and become a better and more fully fledged artist and human is probably not to subtweet your ex about his Pokemon book. Thanks for watching, guys. We want to do more of this kind of weirder stuff, I guess. That's the plan, right? No, like, I want to be doing more, like, stuff in real life, which takes a bit more time to make, I guess. Like, especially stuff like this.
I feel like this is, like, this is less of, like, a video about other people's art and more, like
our own thing.
A story about your own art.
And I kind of want to do more of that, like stories about kind of our lives a bit more. So that's sort of something that we're working on a little bit. And the only way we can really afford to do that and keep doing it is with people that support us on Patreon. So if you do want to do that, you can head to our Patreon. Our subscriptions start at $3 a month. You get access to like all kinds of behind the scenes content. For this video in particular, you can see the full interview that I did with Aron, where I read him an excerpt from the novel, and he slowly loses his mind. So
I've seen bits of it, and it's
it's an experience.
It's excellent. Like,
yeah.
I highly recommend that you watch it.
Yeah, and like we're hoping that when we do these videos, we can put, you know, extended interviews up on the Patreon, or we can put, you know, some development diaries, because I know with the video that you and I are working on, we've got some behind the scenes footage from that, so we'll string together kind of a package.
Fucking heaps of it, dude.
So definitely, yeah, like it's, you know, behind the scenes extra content, and also just help support what we do. So if you want to do that, you can head to our Patreon. It's linked in the show notes, or it'll be linked in the end card. Otherwise, we've got a new video coming up that you and I have been working on, which we'll also link to when it's ready. Yeah, but thanks for watching, and thanks for supporting us. We literally can't afford to do this without your guys' support. So definitely check us out on Patreon. And just if you like the video, let somebody that you think would like it know. That's honestly the best way to help support the channel. Just tell one person, be like, hey, check this out. Because that's what we do with stuff we love. And we often find it's the best way to, find new fans.